today to our Earth Week Keynote Luncheon, Lecture and Dialogue, sponsored by the Macaulay Institute for Mercy Education. And for those of you who may not be familiar, the Macaulay Institute's mission at Salve is our mission, to work for a world that is harmonious, just, and merciful, by sponsoring reflection, dialogue, and action around the tradition of mercy and the critical concerns of mercy. And at today's event, we'll be examining with Dr. Maryanne Loughry the critical concern of climate migration, considering how we can respond with mercy to the world on the move. I'd like to welcome in a special way today the students in my Mercy, Faith, and Justice class. Glad to have you here, and the students in Dr. Candela's Environmental Justice class, both of whom have been examining issues of mercy and justice in relation to the critical concerns, specifically the immigration this semester. Pope Francis, of blessed memory, whose spirit we pray is with us today, maybe even more than ever, authored a prophetic encyclical, Laudato Si, on care for our common home, almost 10 years ago, in which he brought forth the urgent concern of climate migration. He writes, "There's been a tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee from the growing poverty caused by environmental degradation. They are not recognized by international conventions as refugees. They bear the loss of the lives they have left behind without enjoying any legal protections whatsoever. Sadly, there is widespread indifference to such suffering." Pope Francis goes on to urge us. The climate, he says, itself is a common good, belonging to all and meant for all. We have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. We must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. How are we called to respond with mercy to our climate crisis today? How are we called to counter indifference and open our ears and our hearts both to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor? How are we called to respond with mercy to the world on the move? We're grateful today to engage these pressing issues of critical concern with Dr. Maryanne Loughry, a sister of mercy from the community of Australia and Papua New Guinea, who has worked with and for refugees worldwide for over 30 years. At Oxford University's Refugee Studies Center, Dr. Loughry served from 1996 to 2003 as the Pedro Arrupe tutor, and she currently serves as a visiting researcher, investigating the psychosocial effects of refugee displacement, with special attention to climate-induced displacement in the Pacific and the effects of detention on children's well-being. While in Australia, Dr. Loughry also served as Associate Director of Jesuit Refugee Services and has worked in detention centers and refugee camps, conducting evaluations and humanitarian training in Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, the Balkans, the UK, and most recently, the United States. Dr. Loughry serves on the governing committee of the International Catholic Migration Committee and is on the advisory committee of the Caldor Center for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales and the Peter McMullen Center on Statelessness at the University of Melbourne. I asked her how she was in all of those places simultaneously, but this is the work. Presently, Dr. Loughry also serves as a member of Boston College's working group on climate change and migration in the program on global ethics and social trust, and teaches in the School of Social Work, while serving as a senior advisor to the Vice Provost for Global Engagement. Dr. Loughry's PhD is from Flinders University of South Australia, and it was on the subject of detention. I learned just shortly ago. And in 2010, she was awarded the Order of Australia for service to displaced persons. Following Dr. Loughry's presentation, Dr. Craig Condella, our professor of philosophy and cultural, environmental, and global studies, and Kate Johnson, an environmental studies student and soon-to-be graduating senior here at Salve, will serve as respondents, engaging Dr. Loughry in dialogue before opening the floor to all of us. But for now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Maryanne Loughry for our 2025 Earth Week lecture, Climate Migration, Responding with Mercy to the World on the Move.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. I've only ever been on the coastal walk before, so I'm very, very happy to get inside. I hope my Australian accent you'll be able to adjust. The introduction just shows that I'm old. It also shows that I have done 3 things in my life. One is to work at universities. My mother used to call me Sister Mary Meeting because I was always at meetings, and I've also worked always with refugees, and now I've forgotten the 3rd one, but anyway, I will come back to it. Thank you very much for the ability to talk on this topic, which is one of our most pressing topics of our world today. So I'm going to structure it 4 ways. I want to have a look at what the challenge is for our global world and our governance. I want to look at the challenge, dare I, for your university, for Salve, for those directly impacted, and also for why, as we as people of mercy, should pay attention to this. But I want to start with people. I can't tell you this woman's name because she wouldn't tell me her name, but I met her in March when I was in India, doing some research on people they call fishers. Now, I didn't know what a fisher was, but a fisher turns out to be a traditional, they're an indigenous people who have always fished in India. They're not part of the caste system. They are, in their own right, a cultural group, and they are very much at the moment impacted by climate displacement. So we were taken, first of all, I met her, and I met some of her colleagues. I met her son, who helped to translate and tell us the story. I was working with Christ University, which is a Carmelite university in Bangalore, and they're doing this joint research, and they've invited us to be like consultants. So she took me to see her house, where she lives, where her parents lived, and where the grandparents lived, and it's in a coastal area. And what I discovered is that fishers are not just the people who go out in the boats, but also the women who actually sell the fish as such. And she's been one of those, one of the sellers of the fish. And we were outside of her house. She very much had a devotion to Mary, Our Lady, and she pointed out where the church was within walking distance. But she also showed us the house next door. This is the house next door to her. And there were 4 other houses. So her house now is the front line. This is the coastal erosion that is happening to her. So she said to us that she lives in fear. She sleeps in fear because of the waves. And there's no doubt she will lose that home within months. So this is a community of people who are quite poor, simple, traditional, but are living the reality of climate change in a really big way. And it was palpable, literally, when we met them, because we could see the destruction of what was happening in their house, and you can see it as well. They pointed out to us that in front of this area, as I say, there were 5 houses, but then there was also a road and a beach before you actually got to the sea. But now we just have the what's left of the houses and the seawall. Seawalls are important to know about because we think they protect, but they don't. There's nothing that can protect enough against nature and its impact. So what do we know? What do we know, this is the global government, about climate change and climate displacement? Well, and you'll be surprised, I was thinking some of you were probably all born, but not necessarily very old, in 2009. So this is not necessarily something we've just discovered. The Lancet, which is something we highly regard as a research institute, as a journal, as scholars, have said that in the biggest global health threat in our century now is climate change. So that was in 2009. And those of you who remember 2000, we did have deniers in those days. We've got deniers now, but we certainly had more deniers then. But this was front and centre. This is the biggest global crisis. And in particular, a lot of emphasis, which I'm going to come back to, on mental health. Like, what does it mean for you living in an environment where we see and are impacted by climate change? I mean, I work with students who are deciding they don't want to get married or they don't want to have children, because who wants to bring somebody into this environment now? So the anxiety, the concern is pressing. So this is something we know and we have known. Not my country, but I do have ancestors from the country. But in the United States, we also know that you are the world's largest economy. We could debate the impact of that at this time, but also the second largest current emitter of greenhouse gases. The largest ever emitter historically. And you play a significant role, a hugely significant role in addressing what's happening with our climate and climate change. And it's not my role to talk about the current politics, but it's my role just to say you're big players in this at the moment. What we don't know a heck of a lot. One of the things we don't know is how much the events that we attribute to climate change actually are caused by natural events and hazards. Like, the science is still being discovered. Like, how much the hurricane, the tornado, the earthquake, the violent storm is something we would have always had, or is something that's now multiplied because of climate change. We have a science, but we also don't have a history of collecting data. So while we do know it has an impact, the measurements are not something that we are as precise on as we would like to be. And if I go back to my friend, the fisherwoman, she could only recite like several generations of knowledge. So she could tell me where the sea was, where the road was, etc. And then her ancestors could tell me before. And when I've been on Pacific Islands, they'll tell me, you know, this was the atoll, this is where my veranda was, this is where my porch was, whatever. But it's fresh information relative to our world as such. So while we know it's impacted, we don't quite know the extent. When it comes to forced migration, which is my field, one of the things that we're notoriously bad at is predicting who will move, when they'll move, where they will move to. But primarily we've been collecting that data around people moving because of poverty, because of conflict, because of persecution. And now we have climate as well. So you would know, and I'm sure many of you have heard that, people fled the conflict in Syria. Many of them were impacted because of climate. Darfur before, as well as Darfur now, is impacted by climate. So the tribal people or the people who are nomadic get into conflict with each other because they're moving on each other's traditional lands as such. But we, the international world, I've been in, where there's a conflict breaking out, it's very hard to know where people will go. And as I say, when they decide to return or not to return. We just met, Teresa and I met a person as we were walking here from Kosovo. I went to Kosovo during the conflict. It was incredible. Why was it incredible? Because everybody moved. The people in hospital, the prisoners, the sick, and they put them in wheelbarrows and moved them. That's not normally what happens in movement of people in forced migration. They leave behind the elderly, the sick, they often send the young, but again it's very, very unpredictable. So add climate change in, will the women come primarily, will the men come? We don't know. We also have the other thing that we don't quite know is that we've got climate change, and is this different from the people who move because of conflict or the economy? Or is it all together, which seems to be what our thinking is? So you would have heard, people coming up to the Mexican border. Here, some people from like Guatemala, etc., are moving because of the fact that they can no longer have a livelihood. So is that kind of attributed solely to climate change or to government policy in climate change? So again, how much can we say climate change is impacting forced migration, or these people are moving because of the climate? So it's a complex area, but take some comfort, so is the conflict area, so is the persecution for human rights area. There's no one clear definition, there's no one obvious thing, so displacement itself is the problem. How people respond to displacement, what displacement looks like. And again, if I go back to the woman in Kerala, it's something that they're also familiar with, but it's not something that we've traditionally considered in the forced migration sort of area, and that's what we're trying to discover at the moment. One of the things that's very, very important for you to know in the terms of the global governance is that when people move, especially in their own country, which is what primarily people who are impacted by climate change do, is there is no international governance for that population. For refugees, yes. Refugees can only be given a designation of being refugee if they're outside of their own country. So they have to have crossed the border. But many, many people displaced because of climate have moved somewhere else in their own country. So the governance is reliant on the sovereignty of their own country. They will be assisted only by their own people. Now, you know that as well. When we have wildfires here, in theory we had FEMA who would assist, and government, we would have states and federal funding, in theory now. So, because the responsibility isn't for the UN, because the people are still within their own country as such. Now, it gets tricky when people cross different states, etc., in the one country, but there is no global thinking about this. There's no standards for how you look after people. So there's been quite a bit of discussion, and you'll see this if you reflect on the literature, should we now have people called climate refugees? Well, that's pretty well being shot down quickly. One is because, as I say, the vast majority of people impacted don't leave their country. They haven't crossed a border. The other thing is that to be given the designation of being a refugee is you have to have had a well-founded fear of persecution. And I once was on the islands in the Pacific, in Kiribati, and people did not want to be called refugees for two reasons. One is that they still love their government, and they saw refugees as a designation for people who are fearing their government. So they didn't want to be called refugees. But secondly, they didn't want to be seen as looking like people behind barbed wire, which is how we have images of refugees. So at the moment, there's quite a bit of, well, first of all, we don't think we'd ever get up a convention, because if you tried to even modify the existing convention on refugees, it would be probably more restrictive and conservative, given our global reality. But even if we did, we're only dealing with those who've left their own country, and that's not where the majority of people are. But the other issue that people bring up and say, like, are they all the same? Are the people who flee Darfur or Syria because of conflict and climate the same as the people who had to move from California because of the wildfires? Both are impacted by climate, but it's a different impact, so it's not monocausal, as we say. They're not, are we comparing apples with apples? And there's different patterns, like, I don't know whether you know, but for example, in Bangladesh and in Vietnam, people move annually when the floods are happening. And they go and work in another town, and when the floods go down, they go home. Are they climate displaced? Yes. But are they people who need international protection? Possibly. But as I say, they're different to the movements that we hear about. But as I say, don't go completely off this concept, because we have the same issue with conflict and persecution. It's not as if everybody has the same persecution or the same experience of direct or indirect conflict. But it's not going anywhere in a hurry at the moment, the climate refugee, because of our governance at the moment. So I'm going to come back, and I don't expect you, I'm happy to leave the slides, I don't expect you to be able to read the small print. But I just want to say, the way we conceptualise people who've had to move because of extreme weather events internationally is we call them IDPs, internally displaced persons. So that's people who've had to move because of different disasters or conflict, but they're still in their own country. And as you can see, there is actually an organising committee in Geneva who tries to measure who are these people. And at the moment, they're much more than refugees. And there's about 80 million, it was said in the most recent report that we have, IDPs. Then you come down to, they try to look at how many internally displaced people are there because of hazards and disasters. And they've got here to 26.4 million. So we're starting to get a sense of numbers. But the same as I keep saying with conflict, it's like, who are we measuring? Is it the same people who had to leave, from New York when the coastal was eroded, or as I say, from the areas in the South Carolinas? We don't always count you guys in these numbers. We tend to be talking about the poor, other countries, because you have different protections. And the same in my country. In Australia, the driest continent in the world, we of course all the time have climate displacement. That just means people go to other areas of Australia to live. They're not counted as IDPs needing international protection. So we've kind of got different categories, but we are trying to know who they are. So this is just where the global governance is up to. If you could look here, which even I can't look at very well, we talk about people fleeing because of floods, earthquakes, those sorts of things. Myanmar, right now, Myanmar's just had an earthquake, we've forgotten about it. Those people were displaced, so they would be counted in here in a future report. Turkey, that had an earthquake. So that's the sort of data that's being captured in this sort of reality at the moment. The other thing, and I do use often the UN, and I'm often aware in the US some people are not so keen on the UN itself, but here we have Guterres, who's the Secretary General, telling us that what we have to be aware of globally is climate change is not what's causing all our problems in our world. What climate change is a multiplier of what's causing all our problems. So I've already mentioned human rights violations. I've already mentioned conflict. I've persecution, poverty. I've mentioned economics. what happens is climate change exacerbates and multiplies. And I don't mean doubling. I'm meaning 4 times, 8 times, 10 times. So if you're poor and then you're in a country that's impacted by climate change, you're really poor. So if you're a simple fisher and then you've got the tides coming in, you have very little recourse because you're poor and you're in a country that doesn't care at all. So you've got all, caste system, as I've said before, you've got all the issues that are normally exist for people and the multiplier of climate change. So that's kind of a bit of a depressing picture of where we are up to in terms of our thinking about this. The other issue that has, and I mentioned it earlier from the Lancet, is climate change also impacts us in indirect ways, if I can say that. So in terms of water supply, in terms of our health, in terms of extreme heat, weather events, air pollution. So sometimes what we're measuring, people's lung function, is really climate change, but we're measuring lung function. So only a small part is represented in displacement. There's so much more that is impacted by climate change and captured by different disciplines as such. So we do know that it's having a big impact on us as individuals, but we're not necessarily calling it climate change. Okay, back to my friend. I want to keep bringing her in because the numbers, the reality, the horror, the biggest global is often too much for us. So I tend to find, and I've worked forever in refugee work, I love it when I'm in the field because I'm finally with people and you interact with them, you hear their story, they hear your story, and it makes so much more sense. But what it also does, it makes it more complex because you start to realise their reality. So I want to keep bringing her. You could bring many, many other people. So say, I nearly brought the people of Kiribati. And then people are like, where is Kiribati? So when I sometimes talk at Boston College, I feel like I'm talking about Mars when I talk about outside of the US. So I thought I might just stay with the India people know where it is. Why should Salve Regina be concerned? Well, clearly you're concerned about many, many global issues, and in particular concerns that the Sisters of Mercy have put front and centre. And we welcome that. We need you to be the people that can kind of go forth. So that's very, very good. But also, and I want to bring this to your attention and to Salve Regina, is, I mentioned it slightly before, climate change is seen as having a huge impact on youth mental health. And we already have a crisis around youth mental health, full stop. We don't need to multiply it necessarily, but we are with climate change. So there was this little bit of, there's a paper that just came out, 16,000 US citizens, young, were interviewed. And what they were interviewed was about the concerns around climate change. And one of the things that became apparent is that nearly everybody's at least moderately worried, but over half are very worried. So for a university, Boston College, Salve, our population is concerned about this, and it's impacting you. So that would immediately be one reason why we need to be concerned as an institution. The other interesting thing about this research is that they also looked at, will this make a difference as to how you vote? Now this was done in 2023, but if I was an administrator in the university, climate change is influencing how you think politically as well. And that's important for the future, for governance as such. Now you can't see this, and I can't even see it, and I'm right up close. But the very top bar is, on this piece of research, Connecticut and Rhode Island. So they divided the people by states, but the most extremely worried were from Rhode Island and Connecticut in this in this whole research in the US. So you guys are representing very worried people about climate change. This is evidence now. And again, the references here, and people can look at that later. How we call it is something that's debatable. Like, is it distress? Is it well-being? Are you all clinically sick with depression or anxiety? That's a whole discussion. We do talk about climate anxiety. That's now becoming a term. It's not in the DSM-5R or whatever we're up to, but it is a term. So one of the things I think that would concern us is our population here. You are concerned, and so we are concerned. I also want to come back to those directly impacted. So what does it mean for them? There's two ways to look at this. First of all, and this is again our language, how we think about this, there are those people, and I've already mentioned them a little bit, like the people impacted by the wildfires, or the people who have experienced the earthquake. But a lot of us, the vast majority, are indirectly affected. So there's this whole language and thinking around how do we conceptualize the impact. And I always say this when I'm in Boston, Boston is the trauma capital of the world because we've got so many clinicians. So everybody uses the word trauma. I don't like the word trauma because it comes from a kind of, it takes away when we keep saying everybody's traumatized, we take away the language for those who really are traumatized. But you are distressed, you are anxious according to the research, but also indirectly you're impacted. You're impacted socially, politically, economically. So I don't think it's helpful for us just to focus on those displaced because they were in the earthquake, or they were, their farm had a drought for 3 years. That's kind of the direct pathway. But what we have to be focusing on as well is who's indirectly impacted. And they're people like you and me. That's in terms of job prospects, what we can do in the future, where we can live, etc. So the issue of displacement, sometimes we think narrowly, like as I did before, 25 million people moved. But hundreds of millions moved because they were indirectly impacted. And who are they? So I think we need to conceptually think a little bit differently about this poor family's crossing the border, or even my friend in Kerala because her house is about to go. That her village, they're all indirectly impacted as well, even though they've still got a house. So it's a different way of thinking. People of mercy. Our topic. Did I tell you I was a sister? I think I did. Why would we, as people of mercy, see this as an important topic? The main reason is because it impacts people's vulnerability. That if I go back again to California, I'm just trying to give real examples. If you have insurance, you are less impacted to some degree than people without insurance. But what's happening in our world is a lot of the people who are really impacted are the poor. And we heard that from Pope Francis. It's the poor who are really impacted, and that's why it's of concern to us. We have heard and are hearing the cry of the poor. Indigenous people. I mean, I've been to the To'ohano lands in here on the Arizona border. Your own Indigenous people are so impacted by so many issues, and then you have climate on top of that. My own people in Australia, our Indigenous people, the islander people, the sinking islands, they are really impacted because their livelihood, their way of being, their narrative of who they are is gone or diminishing. And so we can't compensate for that. It's just, the woman who I showed you from Kerala, there was a relocation possibility. 10 miles away in a block of units that's nowhere near her church. And she was like, really? Like, that made no sense to her, because her church was important, her community was important, and a block of flats when you're a fisher person, you know, it just didn't make sense. The other is the vulnerability of people in low-income countries. It's no secret that it's kind of chicken and egg. Were they already low-income countries and they're impacted, or are they impacted because they're low-income countries? In the sense of, like, the Philippines, they get floods and disasters every year. So they then have many, many low-income people impacted. So low-income, they have less resources. I often think about Amsterdam. They're impacted by climate change, but they're doing pretty well because of the resources of Europe. Generations. I want to bring back generations to you, because generations are important. I'm an older generation person, and I can think now, oh, we used to have this happen in our weather, and we used to go to the beach in May, and we used to, you know, I can tell those stories. But, like, I've lived a good life. The younger people are really, really, really impacted emotionally and in terms of future, I think. But the older people are impacted health-wise. You know, when we have these terrible heat events, so many old people die because we just don't have air conditioning, especially in poor places. So it's generational. There's no one, you know, when I said before we don't know who's going to move and how they're going to move, we don't know generationally either who will be displaced and who won't, and who will just die because of this. The other, and it's a contentious research area, is people who are close to climate events. Are they most impacted or not? And the research is interesting in this area. The research is that sometimes people who are like farmers are less impacted because they live it, whereas we watch it. You know, there's a kind of a debate about proximity, whether it actually helps you to manage the climate change because you're all the time adjusting to it. Whereas we, sometimes if we're in universities or in other livelihoods, are kind of watching it, hearing about it, slightly impacted, and not the same as those who are living into it. But again, I've got a question mark there because it's a bit of a debate. I've got a couple more things to say. I'm aware of my time. We are not all the same. In this room, we are not all the same. In Kerala, they're not all the same. And that's to do with people's vulnerabilities and also people's resources. Some of us have a lot more opportunity to move, anticipatory movement, to get a better house or whatever, and others are much more vulnerable to the events of climate change because they don't have a lot of resources. And one of the things we can do is to help people be resourced, help us to be able to manage this event that's happening like a train coming down upon us. We can be resourced educationally, resourced work-wise, family-wise, to live this. So it's not kind of something that's going to, an inevitability we have no control over. But we need to be resourced to help it. But I can come back to that. Final thoughts. Okay. Now some of these you will say, Maryanne, you don't know Salve, so what are you on about? One of the things I want to say is, first of all, the numbers continue to be overwhelming. So it's terribly important that you continue to have this on your radar, on your agenda, in your classes. Because, like, look at these numbers. And the time to act is now. So this is not something to think, oh, well, next year we're going to do something, another topic, and climate change, we did that. This is now. You just had a whole week on World Earth Day, and what I've been saying to you, it looks pretty terminal. But But I think one of the things I want to talk about is that you and I can actually be empowered to confront this, or to engage at least in it. But I think it has to be tangible. I don't think it helps just being philosophical. We could have that discussion. Even though what I do is not necessarily going to turn the world around. So you and I have now recycle bins. But what's important is for us to realise we're making a difference. It's not just the recycling, but us to feel a little empowered in this. So I just show you this picture. When I was at the Christ University, they now have a recycle centre and a water collection centre. Now, it wouldn't necessarily work here, what the water recycle, they recycle all the sewage so that it can be put on the gardens. I'm not too big on knowing how to do that. But they also take all their papers and they recycle exam papers, essays, anything that the university has. They have a whole centre for pulping, and they make folders out of them. Now, that's not going to change the world, but they're so proud, and everybody talks about it. So it's something that they're doing as such, something that's tangible that they're doing, and I was very impressed with that. We do at Boston College what you do. I think you might do it better. Research projects where you co-work with people impacted, and I've already heard that that's happening around immigration. I really commend that too, because again, as people of mercy, it's so important that we accompany and come to know the people impacted, partnering with them in different areas, information sharing. Information of what you know from your part of the world, they're all important. Immersion visits. I'm not keen on immersion visits. If we look like we're going to visit, when I was working in the detention centres in Hong Kong for 3 years, we loathed immersion visits because it's like we're in a zoo when they come and look at us. But I think it can be done well, but it has to be done carefully. So, because it's not just about becoming aware of the issue, it's about how to then live with the issue with the people that we visited. And we've also heard as well with Pope Francis's passing his legacy of Laudato Si, which has given us permission to work on this area big time. These are just absolutely, I have no idea about Salve thoughts, but I think what I want to come back to is how to keep it front and centre and alive, so it's not just theoretical, it's a reality and we're engaging in solutions. The last point is one of the things that is being talked about is becoming resilience hubs. Should an event happen in Rhode Island, or should an event happen in wherever you are we prepared? So if there's an extreme weather event, would people know that they could come here to the library, or that they could find water here, or we would know how to have an alert, an alarm? Now, this is I'm only giving it as a small example. Some years ago in the Boston Marathon, when the bombing happened, they stopped the marathon at Boston College, and they came into St. Ignatius Church. Well, what did we need? We needed water, we needed telephones, we needed blankets. Do we have a sense of, this is such a resource, if something happened, what's our contribution? And we know it's a contribution, and we keep it as a contribution. So that, as I say, if something should happen, God forbid, we know what we can bring to the response as such, as a collective. And it's a resilience hub. It's a source for our neighbours and our students to be less vulnerable in the event that it happens. I think I'm going to finish there, thank you, with some engagement. Please forgive me if I misspoke about what Salve is not doing, as I say, and I'm certainly not by any means wanting to compare with Boston College. So thank you, and can my companions come up?
you, Dr. Loughry. Is this on? So we want to get to as quick as we can, because I do want to open up some time for our audience, but I'm going to defer to Kate here and let her give her the first crack.
So I think just like my first question would just overall be, you're talking about kind of the intersection of all these different issues, like social, environmental, economic, and also like psychological. And how do you think like just the average person on a day-to-day basis like can handle that? And how do you think they can make the best and most of it each day in order to help this planet improve?
No, thank you. As I say, I think we have to be, what I'm trying to say is the more we believe that we can make a difference, then the more we can engage with this issue. The only big difference we could make is politically, and that's a long way off at the moment, like the really big difference. Because as you know, we're withdrawing at the moment from initiatives rather than moving forward. But I think what I'm trying to say is it's important for us not to get overwhelmed and thinking it's an inevitability, to get more anxious, to become more depressed. I think there are things we can do. I don't want to say they're symbolic and not making a difference, because it's a little step. One of our sisters wrote many years ago, paths are made by walking. So if we start to make differences, like now, I can just say from my own experience, if I have something in my hand that doesn't look like it's recyclable, I have regrets putting it in the rubbish bin. Like I'm like, oh, and then I think of the landfill. Now I didn't think like that 10 years ago, but I'm much more careful about looking to see what symbols are on it. So, and that's, again, it's not going to change our world, but it makes me feel like I can be part of the changing of our world. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
Yes, so I don't want to get too much into the political moment, but so I get up in the morning and I put the news on. I give myself like 5 minutes to watch it before. It's usually when I'm putting lunch together for our daughters, right? So this morning, right, first story I see is about this car ramming incident in Vancouver, right? This Filipino festival. Second item is these 3 children who were deported as U.S. citizens, one of which is in state cancer, a 4-year-old to Honduras, I believe. And all of this was with the backdrop of the reporter with these mugshots that were up alongside the wall at the White House of immigrants who have been arrested. Right? So I'm thinking about your talk today, and I'm seeing this, and I'm feeling, well, this is going the wrong direction. Right? But it seems like there's a moment in which when we become scared, instead of identifying and helping out those who are differentially impacted, which is a hard thing, I think, philosophically. I think it's hard because we want to think, oh, everybody's equal, but they're not equally impacted here. But the challenge in some ways is to sort of recognize that, overcome that, but there's also that tendency to sort of ball up and become more insular, right? But I do sense, and maybe this is because I teach college and in contact with younger people, that they don't think that way, they don't feel that way, and yet it feels like the trend is sort of heading in the opposite direction forward. So, is this a blip on the radar? Is it a generational thing that maybe, as the younger generation starts to become more politically active, that we get beyond this, or is there something that when we talk about issues of climate, it is so scary that the tendency is to become more sort of isolated and put up more walls rather than become more welcoming to people other than ourselves?
I'm going to answer this a little differently. I've been remarkably impressed in the last week by the tributes paid to Pope Francis. I already canonised him. I've got a lot of disquiet with our church, and in particular with how women are treated. That's just my reality. But when I listen to how he's combated some of the sort of traditions and ways of the church and how they've been spoken about, I thought, I can actually think there is some change happening. I mean, it's not remarkable, and I might tomorrow have a different thought, but it gave me a bit of life to think that his prophetic words, and certainly around migrants and around climate, have been recognised as such. Let's see what the conclave does. But I think back to what you're saying, I can't really speak for the younger generation. As I say, I'm not the younger generation. But our world is certainly not going in a good direction in terms of globalisation and collaboration. We're becoming much more sort of focused in on ourselves economically, etc. And so that's not looking good in a time when we need a global response as such. I do, amongst our students, see great hope. The Sisters of Mercy we were founded to work in this space. Like, our love of the poor, the sick and ignorant is what we are founded for, and you're part of our work. You are our work now. So I hold great hope for you to work with us. But I'm just not sure. We need you to be multipliers, if I can say that, because there are a lot of people who voted differently to how I would vote because of their own concern about their pocket and not thinking about climate. So I think we play a very big role, and Mercy values can impel us to do that, but we have to, in our own ways, respond. And we also, I keep wanting to go back, we mustn't be overwhelmed, because it would be easy to sort of spiral down. The people I see in the Pacific and the people I work with on the border or whatever, they are actually really resilient. Like, they keep going. When I've been into detention centres, they keep going. So they're not passive in response. And I think that's the quest for us is not to be passive either, but I'm saying it's not easy. And we need to work with each other so that we can assist each other. Thanks. Like me, I can't remember my third thing. You can come back to me.
I can open it up for a second, because I do want to
Yeah.
have some time for, I don't want to, I can ask you questions. Esther,
No, on me first.
yeah, I saw your hands.
Thank you first of all for the talk and for the conversation, which is making, I don't know how I want to go about this question.
Yeah.
So first, just to background, I teach Spanish,
Okay.
language, culture, but Spanish. And significantly in the classes, this issue of the environment comes up even in the intermediate level classes, okay? And one of the things that we've been dealing with is with like issues such as the pollution of the water and also the one that is like hitting me a lot is the use of, well, the prevalence of AI.
Yes.
Like ChatGPT and all these things, and I just can't stop thinking about it because you've been talking about natural disasters, but I'm thinking of what we are making and how that is going to impact, probably, although you know it better than I do, the future of the climate. Because what I am understanding is that, I don't know if Sean is here, but we have somebody who just published a book about AI and also the impact on the climate. Mm-hmm. And I'm really, really worried about it. I don't know how to go about it. How to teach without preach,
Yes.
or without,
Yes.
So I don't know and without getting overwhelmed, but that's another one.
I think I've got.
So, I don't know if everybody can hear that I was asked to repeat it, so I don't know if I can let me see if I get the question. So,
I
so the question is about, with new technologies, AI, new methods, what sort of issues are we now creating, and how might we sort of talk about this in the classroom?
Well, because we're talking also about the economic
You can answer the
impact.
question.
No, I'm asking because of the economic impact, right? We're thinking like,
Yeah.
what is more important, the economy and the climate? How, like, if you use AI, you are doing better because it's more present, more important now. I do things faster, I make more money, but I'm killing my planet. Am I?
It's a creating on the other end, right?
I'm very grateful that you mentioned AI, because I think there are new tools emerging that will be of help to us around the climate. There's new scientific tools. I mean, we know with AI now that they're much better at recognising different cancers, because there's an impartiality and a skill that the computers have that individuals don't have. We might know better how to treat it, but you know, so I don't know why I'm thinking this, but somebody told me that one of the worst things you should do is go into a football pool where you sort of bet on the football if you support a team, because your emotions override your decisions. And I think with tools like AI, we're getting better mathematical pathways for understanding what's going on and what happens if changes happen. And that hopefully will also have displacement. As I say, we'll become better predictors of who will be displaced and what their needs are. So the science is improving. The biggest problem we have here at the moment in the US is that the scientists are being reduced as well. Like what's been one of our advances, like NOAA, for example, in looking at the environment, is now being reduced. So, but that's obviously where the areas are going to improve. And I possibly should have said that. I think we've got better tools. What we also are getting is evidence. As I kept saying, we don't know. But sometimes policymakers will change if they have evidence, evidence-based work, and we are getting more evidence. So I think those sorts of things can be useful resources for us moving forward. So we're not, as I keep wanting to say, we're not just passive in this, experiencing, but we need to be engaging with scholarship, with reality, with response. I say that from a psychological perspective, but I also think it from a scientific perspective, so that we feel that we can be part of the change that needs to happen. But it's daunting. And the trouble is, like, who would have predicted a year ago that we'd be in conflict with the EU, and NATO? So at the moment, that's made it it's made it that much more scarier, because our allies are no longer our allies. And so our world is getting shorter in terms of events that are impacting what's impacting us with climate change. So it is daunting as well, but we are getting more skilled at it.
Mentioning the US leaving the EU and being in conflict with NATO, do you think that the US's changing policies and move away from climate activism and combating climate change will impact the way that other countries look at it? Like, do you think it will be a global effect, or do you think it will be primarily just the US?
Yeah, so the question is whether or not if the US becomes less active or pursuing climate issues, will have an impact on the rest of the world and influence them in negative ways.
What I'm seeing is that there's new alliances being formed, because the old alliance at the moment is not necessarily as trustworthy. That can bring creativity. I know at the moment, and one of the bigger challenges is, because we've been very dependent, the rest of the world, on the defence budget of the US, now governments are having to look at their own defence budget. Somebody said to me, that's really good, because it's about time. But the money has to come from somewhere. And often it's kind of in the softer areas that the money comes from. So these are the tensions, but the alliances can be more creative, if I can say that, or more different. I mean, our world is a smaller world. And so if, for example, the EU had to look to Korea or other countries that they haven't traditionally had as such big partners, something new might come that hasn't happened. So I can see some positive as well from us rethinking our global reality. But I am saying it's daunting because where's the leadership? Who's showing the leadership in this at the moment is something that's not as apparent. But no, thank you.
I think one of the things that you said that was really powerful was how it's important to get hands-on and to see things face-to-face, because it's one thing to hear about it or hear about people, animals, or your world being impacted, but it's another thing to be upfront, building relationships. And I think for a lot of younger people especially, they think that that's really out of reach, or like too hard to like go and do. And so how would you think a good way to encourage our community or school would be to step outside and to build like those relationships and see things like up front?
Yeah, so the question was, how do you sort of bridge the gap between sort of making the connections, in the real world with things, outside of the classroom, and how maybe students in Salve in particular might make those connections and sort of relate to others in that way.
Two things came into my head when you were talking. One was my own parents, who weren't big fans of refugees, like many people weren't so familiar. And they came to visit me when I was in Hong Kong working with the Vietnamese refugees. And they were turned around because they met real people who were people. So there are sometimes encounters, like nowadays in different parts of the world, people have dinners or lunches where you just have diversity and you're eating together and you suddenly have a whole new experience of engagement with the people. And I think it's a mercy value for us to, like we always had when we were founded, houses of mercy, where you would meet people who would be poor and beggars and former prostitutes and whatever, that we wouldn't normally have gone to school with, but we would have a different way of perceiving the population. So I think ordinary encounters, like not big encounters like I'm now going to get a new career necessarily, but as I say, social encounters can be very, very helpful. The other sort of story that I was thinking about is Boston College, sorry guys. We have this, a lot of students do a semester abroad. They all want to go to Madrid. Why Madrid? Because it's the party capital apparently for Boston College. But there's so many other places, like Kosovo or Croatia, that can actually give us a whole new thinking and a whole new world, a whole new cultural experience. So I think the opportunity, and I often say this to my students, is don't go back to what you know or what your sister or brother did, but like do something different, especially when you're young and you can do it before the mortgage and the, whatever kicks. So I'm always thinking of, where we holiday, how we holiday. We often find ourselves doing what everybody else does, but that encounter with the other, this is another silly story, but I'll say it anyway. There was an earthquake in Myanmar the other week, and my sister, who lives in Asia, was in Thailand. So they got evacuated from her hotel. Okay, that's good. So she had the experience of finding out who lived in the streets behind the hotel. Oh, she had no idea. First of all, there were better coffee shops. But secondly, she saw the workers themselves. And she was telling me about how engaging it was. Now, it was just 2 streets away, but she just would normally check in at the hotel. So it's those sorts of encounters, but reflecting on them, and being with people that you can reflect on, what does this mean? And I'm sure Salve does that all the time. And in one sense, so does Boston College, but sometimes we get funneled into this is how you do it, and we do it the way it's always been done. I think our world is an excellent opportunity to engage in difference as such, and that's what I really encourage you to, in small ways as well as big.
Teresa, did you want to say anything in closing? Because I know we're getting short on time, so.
Thank you so much for what you shared, for the questions, and for the engagement on our panel as well. I know I was struck by the that statistic that you shared around Rhode Island and
Yes.
Connecticut. We here have the most angst, and maybe because we're so close to the proximity of the ocean, I was like, what is the source of our
And affluent people are next to the ocean.
what is kind of pressing of loss as well. But you then kind of charge us towards mercy. But in that example, to say that somehow in our own kind of angst, our response to this climate crisis is for maybe most of all for the people of Rhode Island and Connecticut, like to need to remedy, that disease, that struggle. And so maybe I appreciate the ways in which your talk today calls us to works of mercy for the world, but also on behalf of ourselves. And maybe that is a new kind of invitation that could be a catalyst of mercy in the world that we desperately need. So thank you so much for all that you share for our community here and for the global community. And please join me in thanking Sister Maryanne.